All right, everybody, we're going to kick off our last keynote for today.
Yep. Our last guest of the day is Mike Phalen, who has been with Boston Scientific since 1998. Before joining Boston Scientific, Mike held various management positions with MD Technology, Kendall Healthcare, and Penn Pharmaceuticals. He is a proud graduate of Villanova University and holds an MBA from Fairleigh Dickinson Business School.
Mike is currently Executive Vice President and President of Medical Surgery and also sits on the Executive Committee for Boston Scientific, which is a worldwide developer and distributor of medical devices. He plans and executes on their overall strategic goals, and he oversees the firm's global operations in Canada and Latin America. Please join us in welcoming Mike Phalen to the stage.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Where's your clicker?
Thank you. Well, I appreciate you all sticking around for the final discussion, and it's firstly an honor to be invited to participate in this conference. Just a little sidebar. It's been a very interesting day. I'm the chair of Mass Medic, and just up the street in Waltham, we had a big meeting today featuring about 26 startup companies in the medtech space. And my head's spinning because so much of what I heard here this afternoon was being represented live just down the street from companies that are really trying to innovate and deal with the complexity of the medtech space and health sciences in general. So I think we can combine sort of all the thoughts today and hopefully address some discussion points here this afternoon. Well, let me get started. I titled this talk, The Medical Device Industry, Evolving and Innovating. And I think that's a really relevant topic. I had a chance to sit in on one of the tracks on the medical device and diagnostics piece. And I sat in the last 20 minutes of it, but I could tell it was very directionally consistent with what I'm going to talk about here today. I can work with the lights or without the lights. So let me just give you just a quick fun facts. I won't drain the slide, but you know, medical device industry is a really important industry for the United States, and it's a very dynamic industry. It's one of the largest businesses in the U.S. We have historically, as a nation, led the era of innovation through this very sophisticated and complex ecosystem between, bench research, companies, both private and public, and of course a very vibrant venture arm that creates this innovation ecosystem. That's really been part of the U.S. Growth engine for the last, call it 40 to 50 years. There's about 6,500 companies in the United States. Massachusetts obviously is a very important area for innovation, particularly in life sciences and certainly in med tech. Our company has a big operation in Minnesota. I often think of I think of California, Minnesota, and Boston as sort of the three big med tech hubs. But as you can see on the slide, many states have novel programs with very compelling company technologies. Between 2000 and 2010, some of this data started getting benchmarked, and you can see that medical advancements helped to really make some meaningful impact in healthcare. Fatalities from heart disease were declined by 30%, and we were able as an industry to reduce stroke by over 36%. Those are just big diseases and big numbers. Let me just take it down to the state of Massachusetts. So this is really, I think, an important slide just in terms of setting expectations for the state. Can you guys see that at all? Can you guys bring the lights down a little bit? Okay. Well, Massachusetts is home to the second largest contribution of medical device manufacturers and R&D development. We have almost 500 companies here in the Bay State that are focused in the med tech sector. We employ over 80,000 workers and about $8.5 billion worth of economic value associated with the state of Massachusetts. So it's a big part of the Bay State. And this meeting this morning was really featuring a lot of companies from Massachusetts that are really early stage, really compelling, innovative companies. And I'm talking about small startups, 1 to 3 employees with a novel idea and a little bit of seed money. And I'm telling you, the folks that are coming out of the programs today, certainly this program, are going to make a big difference in the way healthcare is treating patients throughout the world in the next generations. So very, very important. Let me just take a little bit of time and talk about Boston Scientific. So I've been with the company for 27.5 years, so I've seen Boston Scientific emerge from essentially a startup company to today what would be considered a large cap med tech company. We have revenues approaching $8 billion. We have a big product portfolio, over 13,000 kinds of devices. We're a very active company, as you can tell from intellectual property and technology know-how. We invest approximately $800 million a year in R&D. We have about 24,000 employees. That number's changed a lot the last 5 to 6 years. A huge emphasis on the emerging markets and making our company a much more globally connected company. So we're bringing on more and more talent in the company in markets outside the United States. We have a very global presence. We ship product every 2 seconds. And we're proud to say that our products treat more than 22 million patients a year. And you don't have to go very far away from your own family to realize the value of the portfolio that our company has. And in fact, I have my mom, my 2 uncles, my brother are all beneficiaries of Boston Scientific technologies. And just by way of that last presentation, those biopsy forceps, Boston Scientific's the largest manufacturer of biopsy forceps in the world. So that's really compelling data, and it was interesting to see that as an example. Okay. A little bit more about the product portfolio, and I won't spend a lot of time. Most people know Boston Scientific as a cardiovascular device company. You know, we were one of the emerging companies many years ago to develop interventional cardiology stents for treating coronary artery disease. That's a big part of our business today, but we've much more diversified today. We have 3 business segments. We have a cardiology business, which encompasses interventional cardiology and peripheral vascular disease, so those 2 businesses. We have what we call a rhythm management business. This is made up of implantable cardiac defibrillators, pacemakers, cardiac resynchronization devices, and an electrophysiology business. That's our rhythm management business. And then the business that I oversee is what we call our MedSurg segment, and that is our endoscopy business, our urology women's health or urology pelvic health business, and a really compelling business to treat chronic pain and deep brain stimulation, which we call our neuromodulation business. And this is just an example of a little bit of Boston Scientific's portfolio, and it's one that right now has been really active and doing quite well as we continue to globalize our business. So what does it all mean in terms of the changing nature of healthcare? That product portfolio 15 years ago, our concentrated call point was the physician, maybe the physician and the nurse, maybe the physician, nurse, and the technician, and the hospital environment. And that's, you know, who we spent all of our energy and effort. That was our commercial emphasis. But as you can see from this chart, you know, back in the day, if you will, hospitals were one entity, and the doctor offices and the doctor practices were another. And over the last several years, we've seen a massive shift in terms of ownership. So physician practices, at least here in the United States, have been acquired by the healthcare systems. And so now, all of a sudden, the stakeholders for medical devices have really started to change. And, you know, as I said before, it used to be physicians and hospitals, and that's where we would concentrate our selling and commercial efforts. But today, those hospitals have aggregated, consolidated, have become part of healthcare systems, both at what we call the GPO level, the group purchasing organization level, or at what we call an integrated delivery network. And then there's a million little variations on the theme that dot the landscape throughout the United States. And what's fascinating is kind of the discussion we just heard. In some cases and in some markets, the line between the payer and provider is blurred. So for example, I use the Kaiser example, where here is both a provider and insurer. And so the stakeholder group for med tech companies has become much more challenging, much more vibrant, and much more dynamic. And so one key takeaway is if you're going to develop technology, you want to be in the med tech space, you've got to align your commercial efforts to all of these stakeholders, and you've got to do it really well, and you can't ignore any one of those groups. One of the other things that I think is a challenge for the industry is, Boston Scientific, we've sort of made our living in this gray bar, this treatment bar. And that has been where all of our energy and effort, all of our R&D collaboration, all of our globalization efforts have been in trying to treat that existing patient population. But there are studies and there are people that suggest that because of the dynamic change in healthcare going on, more and more emphasis is going to be placed on better diagnostics, better predictive analytics, more monitoring. And so it creates both an opportunity and a challenge for the traditional med tech company that kind of lived in that treatment pool to start to evolve and think about ways in which you can activate and participate in these evolving market segments. Now, the other thing that's happening is we see a huge amount of change with demographics. And as I mentioned, or you guys mentioned in the beginning, I oversee Latin America and Canada for Boston Scientific, two very different parts of the world. But we have a massive changing demographic shift that we're dealing with. The emerging markets, 2/3 of the world's population resides in 3 countries. And that's very difficult for people to understand, but between China, India, and Brazil, that's 2/3 of the world's population. And those markets are massively underpenetrated in terms of access to quality health care. So it represents a very compelling opportunity for companies like Boston Scientific. It's also a very challenging environment because of the economic differences in those markets. We also see this global population growth becoming an issue, and obviously trying to tackle the law of big numbers and playing in those markets creates a very interesting dynamic shift for the global healthcare space. And then probably the thing that sort of cuts across every market, and it really is every market today, is financial pressure. So there is a massive amount of challenge to everything that happens in healthcare, and particularly in the medical device industry. It used to be that we could have a developed technology and we could iterate it generation after generation after generation. We would improve the device, we might improve the size of it or the lubricity of it, and we would be able to charge a premium for that, and that's kind of how the model ran for many, many years. That model's challenged today because you have to show really compelling economic value. And that's on the existing portfolio. So when you get into an R&D situation, you're trying to develop novel new technologies, you have to be really careful about what you're trying to go after and whether or not you can actually deliver a compelling economic value statement. So here's just some slides that sort of tease out that whole theme. Because we have changing healthcare economic value propositions happening all over the world, with limited resources, do we, for example, spend money to treat a single child, or do we spend a very sizable amount of money to go after a bigger, compelling disease? And these are things that are being wrestled with by not only companies in medtech, but certainly by the payers and the providers. Another slide, with, again, limited resources or finite resources, do you focus your R&D efforts on the predictive side and the diagnostic side, or do you try to evaluate and be better served at treating the end result? Again, very compelling challenges to the space. And in particularly with med tech, this is sort of the challenge that we're faced with. With limited resources, do we try to treat a single patient with aortic stenosis with a minimally invasive valve technology, which this, by the way, is one of the hottest areas in med tech today throughout the world, or do we move along the lines of trying to be better at the prevention side of the equation. Just a couple things to think about. So I know there's a lot of folks here that are interested in medical devices and medical technology. I thought I would just show a fairly simple algorithm that on paper looks very, very simple, but in fact is actually a pretty complex algorithm. And this is our approaches to medtech innovation. So one high-level thing is, do you go after an established market, or do you try to go after a new market? Established market means there are companies and technologies and coding, coverage, and reimbursement, or do you try to go after something that's truly not been done before and is novel? If you choose the established market, then you're really by default talking about trying to have a market share product where you think you have a better idea than the other guy, and by virtue of your technology, you should be able to acquire a bigger percentage of that market. If you choose to go down the new technology path, you're really developing something that's brand new and novel. Now, companies the size of Boston Scientific have very strategic choices to make. Do you try to do this on your own through your organic product pipeline? Just a little note from the track earlier today. MedTech companies, on average, probably spend anywhere between 6 to, say, 10% of their global sales in their R&D budget, right? That's coming under a lot of stress. We have to not only have economic, clinical value, does it work, but we have to have economic value to prove that it's worthy. And on top of that, we're massively regulated. And so this is a big deal for companies. And the companies that are in the public market have to have a 90-day report card, and there's no mercy. You have to produce every 90 days. So with, again, finite resources, do you try to develop the technology organically, or do you look to augment your pipeline and your portfolio through business development? And we certainly do both of those at Boston Scientific. If you choose the path of an established market product, there's probably a fairly clear regulatory path that someone has already plowed that field. If you choose to go down the path of brand new technology, you definitely face regulatory uncertainty, and that's a very big hurdle for companies in this space. If you choose the established path, you probably have more clarity around coding, coverage, and payment. If you choose to go down the new market or new product path, that is less clear. If you choose to go down the established path, you're going to run into probably many companies. This is a market and a business that's dominated by oligopolies, 2 to 3 players controlling 80 to 90% of the market. So if you're number 4, 5, or 6, it's a hard business to crack because of scale and because of competitiveness. But, if you choose to go down the path of a new technology, a novel technology, you have that first market limited competition. And the bottom line is both carry some price sensitivity. It doesn't really matter which way you go. And really the takeaway from this slide is that either pathway you choose has sort of some unique risks and unique opportunities. Now, if you layer on sort of the original Boston Scientific slide of less invasive medicine, then you kind of can layer this on where your choices now are either the left path or the right path, but then you have to decide what kind of technologies you're going to be in. Are you going to be purely in that therapeutic game, which is where our company has made most of its living, or are you going to migrate and move your portfolio to earlier stage disease diagnosis and palliation, disease diagnosis or screening, or do you try to move away from the therapeutic side and into more palliation for, say, cancer patients, et cetera. So this is sort of the dilemma that both small, novel medtech companies face getting into the space, and it's the same dilemma that established strategic companies like Boston Scientific are challenged with each and every day. Now, I just also wanted to just provide this. I'm not going to drain this slide just for the sake of time, but there is a huge amount of medical device technology that surrounds the body. I just sat on my whiteboard the other day and just wrote these out, but these are some examples of the various kinds of technologies that are out there. And I'm sure I've missed some major segments, so I don't mean to offend anybody, but there's a big opportunity in med tech to innovate and to play a role in treating this patient. So, not only do med tech companies continue to innovate their pipeline and their portfolio, this first slide here, this under the product here, this is the Boston Scientific Watchman device. Fascinating technology. This is for patients that are atrial fibrillation patients, which affects huge populations in the United States, and it puts patients at risk for stroke. They're at a very statistically higher risk at stroke. And my mom's an AFib patient. She requires to take her anticoagulation medicines every day, and she has to have blood drawn at least once a week or once every 2 weeks. And she does okay with it, but it's still problematic. And it's problematic in the elderly population, just trying to balance the INR level. So here's a technology where we put a device, an interventional catheter, through the heart, and we occlude the left atrial appendage and essentially seal it off. And that's the source of blood pooling in an AFib patient, and that's the cause of stroke. So, we're going to innovate those kinds of technologies. The middle column represents a very simple application that our company recently developed. So one of the businesses I oversee is our urology and pelvic health business. And one of the biggest areas of urological care is urinary stone disease, patients that develop stones in their kidney or in their ureters. And the standard of care today throughout the world is to go in and remove that stone either with a device or through an external methodology. But all those patients get stented with a simple indwelling ureteral catheter. Now, you talk about readmittance to the hospital. It's amazing how many patients have an indwelling catheter placed and never come back to the doctor to have it removed. It's not intended to be in your body for life. And when that device gets occluded and crystallized, and it causes a lot of problems. So we developed a simple application, a little iPhone app for the patient, the caregiver, and the hospital to keep track of the indwelling stents, because there's millions of these things put in every year. Very simple. So we're kind of innovating not just our product pipeline, but we're also trying to innovate around services and support. And then lastly, the business model piece. This is probably the one that's the most challenging for companies, and that's really this whole concept of medical device technologies, which historically sold to doctors and nurses, today have to deal with the complexity of the healthcare procurement side. But really now with big systems and big institutions, they're looking for value and partnership and risk sharing and all that. So how does a med tech company evolve from something where they're really great at catheter innovation to being really great at risk sharing, at financial arrangements, et cetera? And so that's another big area of business model evolution that's taking place, certainly within our company and many companies in this field. This is a slide intended to just kind of put all you guys on notice that this is an exploding area. I'm sure you are all aware of that. The mobile application and the mobile health is unbelievable. There are some people that think that this market's going to be $26 billion market by 2017. There are many, many people on the planet that can talk about this in much more color clarity than I can. But it does represent a sea change level to this space. So historically, the med tech companies have been catheter-based or big iron-based in very significant clusters. But new to the market are the big IT companies with huge market caps, huge R&D capability, and they're really pushing the envelope here with mobile applications to better diagnose, better treat, and keep patients more connected. And I think this is an unbelievably cool field for people coming out of MBA programs to be involved with, because this is clearly where we're going thanks to the power of computing technology and the phones. So let me end with just one last slide. No matter what happens, I think medtech in general is trying to evolve. We're not perfect, and we're certainly on a journey like everybody in healthcare. I think medtech as a space and companies continue to innovate. There's some really smart people working in this industry. We're talking the best and the brightest, and it's a beautiful relationship between engineering and health science professionals We get to deal with physicians and nurses and some of the most highly educated people in the world. And we're tackling problems that impact mankind. So it's a wonderfully noble profession to be involved with, and it's a very rich and compelling ecosystem that makes up the whole network. But as a med tech company, right, and if you choose to go into the med tech space, there's sort of 4 foundational questions that you still have to answer each and every day as you continue to evolve and innovate in the space. And these 4 questions have been sort of pillars in Boston Scientific for many, many years now. The first one is something foundational. Does the technology work? Can you prove it? Will people believe you? And can you execute and foundationally make money at it? And so despite all of the changes and all of the energy and the enthusiasm, as I listened to these 26 companies this morning, I kind of ran this checklist through my head. Does the technology work? And that's a big bar. You got to be able to prove it. Just because you prove it doesn't mean the Blue Cross and Blue Shield folks are going to believe you, right? So there's a big hurdle there. And then finally, you have to be able to execute and make money at it. And so this is kind of how we guide ourselves and how I think about the med tech space in general. I think it's the best of times in this industry. There's many bright minds coming into the sector. I think the mobile health is going to energize and kind of blur the lines between the therapeutic, diagnostic, and screening side. At the end of the day, though, and I travel all over the world, you get to interact with real human beings, real patients, and it's very satisfying when you know your device or your catheter or your imaging platform played a role in those human beings. And it's exceptionally cool when you can do it in markets where healthcare is just coming online. I'll end with this last note. We just celebrated, I think it's the 500th patient where our company's provided colonoscopy screening in the Amazon River on a boat for patients that take boats to get there just to have a chance at some very predictive and very good screening-based technology. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
It's been a long day, but there's a couple. I know there are.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very thought-provoking presentation. I was referring to the slide. You indicated all the areas of innovation, and the last item on the slide was, I think it was surgical robotics.
Yes.
And I know that Intuitive obviously has a big play there, and Google and J&J and Stryker and Mako. I'm wondering, are you guys moving in that direction?
Are we moving in that direction? How do I diplomatically answer that? In elements, I think we explore it. We have not taken a position, at least to the best of my knowledge today, in our current portfolio. Some of the portfolio technologies that we have today may not lend themselves to the advantage that platform provides, but it is a hot area in healthcare. It's certainly a hot area in med tech, and we talk to a lot of companies in that space. Is that a fair question, fair answer?
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Just had a question. Is the med tech industry having to shift a little more to software and think about that a lot? And how are software revenues treated under the current med device tax law? And what are some of the challenges you've had to think about when shifting more resources to software?
So that's a great question. So parts of the Boston Scientific portfolio are software laden, software dependent. Some of them are very traditional. We make a generator that's got some computer algorithm and it drives a catheter. But more and more we see the world evolving towards connected devices. So 2 of our businesses, our rhythm management business with implantable defibrillators, those are all remotely turned on, turned off in service. So there's a big element there. There was a session at Mass Medic a few months ago on security consciousness with IT connected devices. So that's an area that we have to think about. The revenue side of it, or the treatment side of it, is still, I think, a gray zone, at least for our company. But the real issue for us becomes one of what parts of the portfolio lend themselves to that IT application, and where does that stop and end? And those days that continue to evolve. It evolves every month. There's many companies that come across our desk that are trying to develop different algorithms for different diseases. And in some cases, in some of our portfolio, it makes sense for us to explore that option, and that's certainly what we're doing.
In one of your previous slides, you show that there's somewhat of a shift in this industry toward, or I should say, away from treatment and more towards, diagnostics and prevention. I was wondering if you could speak to the political pressures that are sort of pushing away from that movement, and if you encounter a lot of those. Specifically, like, people can go into Congress and say, look, I had this disease, this device saved me, we need to spend money on this, and it's not really a dramatic story if they say, or it's not even a story at all if they say, I never had a disease.
Yeah, well, from a med tech perspective, our biggest, most public battle, if you will, has been the medical device tax, and I know the group talked about it earlier. That's a very hot topic in DC right now. There's a reasonable chance that tax gets repealed. There's pretty good alignment on both sides of Congress that is sort of a punitive tax for the industry, and it affects the ecosystem. It certainly affects jobs, et cetera. But I think the issue ultimately in terms of where companies go is still the company's choice. So, as a corporation, we could continue to focus on treating patients with certain levels of disease. I think if you step back and look at, general population management and all that, there's going to be a need to try to, not let that disease progress. And so it challenges a company like Boston Scientific to say, do we start to move to the left and actually invest more dollars in either predictive analytics or early stage diagnostics? And that, historically has not been, how our company was built. So those are the strategic questions that are faced, that face the executive committee and the board at Boston Scientific, and it faces all companies that, we compete with.
How much has your business model changed with the regulations around how you can market directly to providers and how you can incentivize certain providers to use your products? Like before, it was common to have lunches and dinners and entertainment, and that has been strictly regulated now.
Yeah.
That changed a lot how you market, how you...
Well, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but let's say within the last 12 years or so. So I'm also a member of AdvaMed. I sit on the AdvaMed board for Boston Scientific. AdvaMed is a medical device affiliation association in DC, and we adopted a sort of a corporate integrity policy on the best practices for engagement. A lot of this was driven by pharma. So, today we're massively regulated. And so, it's interesting because we're here in the state of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has its own set of rules for engaging healthcare providers. And I understand the intent of it. The reality of it is it sort of impacts kind of the classic innovation model, which sometimes is done over a cup of coffee or over dinner. So we've adopted our policies. I think we're good with it. It doesn't affect our performance, but we are mindful of the code of conduct and the way we conduct ourselves dealing with healthcare providers. And it's particularly interesting on a national scale, but it's very interesting here in Massachusetts, in the state of Vermont, and in the state of California, because they have their own little policies. And by the way, all of that stuff is available online, so you can see that in the public domain, how much money we spend on physician consultants, how much entertainment dollars we allocate, et cetera. It's all part of this, what they call the Sunshine Act.
I wanted to thank you very much for your presentation today. Particularly enjoyed it as a previous Boston Scientific employee. It's great to see how the company's doing today. My question is about your expansion into developing markets. You mentioned that you're now trying to tap the sort of the underserved communities, mostly in China, India, Brazil. I'm wondering what are the challenges you're facing as you expand into those markets, what your strategies are, and basically how the company is going to enter those markets.
Yeah, it's great question. So I'll give you just a couple things to think about. Number one, the big patient populations there represent significant opportunity. And so you can't ignore those patient sizes. Number two, each country's regulated by a certain different set of rules. Probably the hardest thing for multinationals is interpreting what those rules are. For example, in China, it's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult for multinationals to compete at the same level as the local companies. Yet at the same time, the local companies, if China wants to be on the global scale, they have to respect and be respectful of the intellectual property. And so there's more joint venture work happening now in China than ever before. The rules are still somewhat interpreted as to exactly how that plays itself out. In some countries of the world, you get favorability if you're locally manufacturing. The definition of locally manufactured product is open for interpretation. So what we've tried to do is not send a bunch of Americans in and figure it out. What we've tried to do is hire local subject matter experts, people that speak the language, know the culture, have access to the government officials, and really try to operate at a local level. And, the jury's still out as to exactly where that's going to be a successful formula or not. But again, we can't ignore those patient populations. And particularly, we do very well in the emerging markets. It's one of our fast-growing segments, but we're only capturing a very small percentage of the total patient population. So there is a real business need and a human need for companies, for multinational companies to collaborate locally and to ultimately become part of what I like to refer to as the local healthcare system.
So on one of the other slides, you had mentioned that you're starting to focus more on payers and providers as you're looking at the product innovation process. What about consumers and actual patients, especially in the light of traditionally consumer products, companies like Amazon, Apple, Google, moving into healthcare? Is it a threat that you're looking at, or how, especially since most of your devices are implantable, how is that coming into play?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a big threat to our traditional business today, but it's certainly on the horizon. Historically, MedTech, going back to my slide, has been a clinically trained, highly competent rep engaging with a doctor and a nurse and maybe a hospital administrator. And the value of that technology gets discussed and moves forward. Today, because hospitals have been acquiring practices, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, the physicians have been greatly marginalized. So the expert person that's using the device doesn't have quite the same seat. They have a seat at the table, but they don't have quite as much decision-making prowess as they once had. Now, we're working hard to sort of say that's important, but we treat all the constituencies the same. We try to treat them all the same. I think the big challenge for companies like ours and companies that have historically been in the medtech space is where do we go? Do we do direct to consumer, kind of like pharma has done? Well, the margins and the scale of that is very different in medtech than in the pharmaceutical industry. I would say that we're spending much more of our time being more smart with our marketing dollars and using the power of social media to access and energize the right kind of patient segments and physicians that treat those patients. So a lot more work to be done, but clearly this is, it's not going to be the old product manager of yesteryear. It's going to be somebody much more sophisticated in terms of target marketing and capability to sort of activate those business opportunities. And it's rapidly evolving as we speak.
Great. Sorry, we are out of time. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
One moment, please, before we depart. I got a few closing comments. And I know, because some of you have been here since 7:30 this morning, that equals almost 10 hours, which means that I probably should not speak for, I don't know, a half an hour. In fact, I've just concluded that I have 3 minutes, and exactly 3 minutes, and then I'll make it 5:29, and then I'll get you out early. So here's my goal. We have been on a sprint of the health sector since about 8:30 this morning. It's been a remarkable journey. We've been looking at innovation, we've been looking at transparency, we've been looking at patient engagement. And when I think of the things that we've covered since 8:30 today, I actually think about the health sector management program here at Questrom and why we all believe it is absolutely essential that people understand all the different parts of the mosaic of health sector in this country. You can't just understand pharma and not understand the payers. You can't just be in the provider space and not understand biotech. Everything is interconnected. Even our different speakers today have spoken to that. So let me just share with you some of the things that we have done since 8:30 this morning, with one line from each. Peter Slavin, MGH, we are in a revolution going on here in Boston in both care delivery and biologics. We had the Terrier Talks. I'll just mention two things, so do it, and consumerism. Then we had Ido from American Well. He spoke about, we are also using the word, by the way, a revolution, and that within 3 years, 20% of us will be using telemedicine. Then we had Brigitte Schoberl from Merrimack Pharmaceutical, and she said cures are built, using that engineering philosophy there. Then we had the lightning rounds, and the way I can sum that up is just one word: wow. Then we had the quality keynote with Kevin Churchwell from Children's, and what I was really struck with was two things: road to high reliability, and also take on your weakness. Then we had the breakout sessions covering all different sub-themes that I mentioned, and I have also one word for that: wow. Then we had two final keynotes. One with Andrew Dreyfus, an insurance keynote, talking about AQC, the alternative quality contracts, and what that means for all of us. The last slide was about us as patients or consumers, but also talking about providers and payers. And then most recently with Mike Phalen and medical devices and keynote, I was really struck with the evolution of the stakeholders within medical devices in this country and that industry. And so the field is moving extremely fast, kind of on the pace that we've been on today. I appreciate all of you. I want to highlight a couple folks who made today possible. Dean Ken Freeman talked about the broader committee this morning, but I want to highlight all of them: Nina, Deepak, Cassandra, Kim, Sheree, Elena, Kevin, and Frank. You've done a remarkable job pulling together a 10-hour sprint of health sector in this country. So thank you for that. And lastly, of course, I want to thank all of you, the diehards, the ones who actually stayed the full 10 hours that are here. You and the sponsors are what made this thing really come together with all the amazing speakers we've had. The reception, it is 5:29, starts right now, and your drink ticket should be in your name tag. Enjoy and see you here next year. Thank you.